respect to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome anybody who's of Aboriginal or Torres Strait descent here today particularly. And I want to also recognise the traditional custodians, the Indigenous peoples, for their valuable contributions to Australia and global society, and to learning which has occurred on this place and at the University of Queensland for many, many generations. So dementia, as was said in the introduction, is a major health issue, and I'm not going to labour the point, just to say that it is a problem that we've known about for many years. It costs the governments a lot of money to care for people with dementia. There is no treatment that can stop dementia, and as the population ages, the incidence of dementia is still increasing, and because the populations of the at-risk group is increasing, this is going to become quite a burden, and not just in monetary terms, but also in terms of the carers, families and friends that provide the care of people with dementia. So what is dementia? I think it's important to define this because it's not always clear in the general community what dementia is. So dementia is defined as a decline in intellectual functioning that is severe enough to interfere with the ability to perform routine activities. Okay? It's an umbrella term that covers a number of different dementias, and often dementia and Alzheimer's disease are used interchangeably. But Alzheimer's disease is just one of the dementias, but it is the majority of dementia in our community. Other dementia includes vascular dementia, and there's quite a lot of overlap in the pathology between vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Also Lewy body dementia. This is the type of dementia that people who get Parkinson's disease, many or most of people with Parkinson's disease will also develop dementia, and it's a Lewy body dementia. And then there's frontal temporal dementia and many much rarer forms of dementia. Now, before somebody is diagnosed with dementia, they might undergo a prelude called mild cognitive impairment, where there are changes in cognitive abilities, but they're not severe enough to interfere with daily living. But it's a sort of a transition, just so you can know when you hear these different terms what they mean. So what are the signs of dementia? Not surprisingly, cognitive impairment, but that can manifest in many different ways. Problems communicating, misplacing things, day-to-day forgetfulness, problems with language, changes in personality, poor judgment. And different dementia types manifest in different ways. So Alzheimer's disease is very much associated with changes in memory, planning, and problem solving, whereas something like frontal temporal dementia is much more likely to be, or Lewy body dementia rather, is more likely to be linked with changes in personality and changes in judgment of what is appropriate or not appropriate behaviour in a particular context. So what shouldn't be here? Anybody see something that maybe shouldn't be in the fridge?
The speaker. The speaker next to the pasta sauce.
Oh no, I don't know what that is, but keep looking. Watch, yep. So, I think most people here, hopefully everybody, will understand that a watch, it would be unusual to be in the fridge, okay? Now, we all, I'm sure, have, put, I don't know if people store the peanut butter in the fridge, but put something in the fridge, say a thing of flour. Put the flour in the fridge because they're busy packing things up, okay? But having opened the fridge again, you would probably recognise that that's probably not where it should be stored, okay? But people with Alzheimer's disease, they don't understand that that's inappropriate. Another example would be Many people leave, the vegetables on the stove and they might boil dry, and that's because you're distracted or your attention's somewhere else. But you understand that that's a problem that has changed, as opposed to trying to remember, why would you put vegetables in a pot on the stove? To cook them, obviously, but that would be the change, the dramatic changes that interfere with your daily living. And one of the reasons that I believe that this sort of thing where you do something, you lose your keys, is in normal life, manifests in a way that also mimics things in Alzheimer's disease, is because when you have, when you're distracted or very busy, your attention is reduced, and when you have dementia, you actually have a reason why you can't pay attention, and so it might manifest in the same way. But just because you've got poor attention doesn't mean you've got dementia. Where's the watch? So, the cognitive symptoms, deficits in attention. If you can't pay attention, you can't learn, and therefore you have problems with learning as well. Learning is basically memory. You have to learn something, you have to put it into your memory system, and therefore memory is one of the major things in Alzheimer's disease. Problems in language, being able to recall words within the category. Donald Trump was famous for being able to list, animals starting with E or something, and therefore he didn't have dementia. So that's one of the tests one does do. And so fluency, object naming, being able to retrieve words is something that gets tested for and can be a deficit. And executive functions, mental manipulation of information, ideas, problem solving, and visuospatial abilities. So I don't know if people have read Still Alice. It's a book about a woman. It's a fiction book, but it's very, very well researched, about a woman who actually has early onset dementia, and one of the first manifestations is actually that she gets lost, and that's a big problem in people with Alzheimer's disease. So the dementia in people with Alzheimer's is because the healthy brain tissue is degenerating, and it causes a steady decline in memory and mental abilities. It's not normal aging. And it is a fatal disease that affects the brain, and those cognitive changes, as I said, are due to the loss of nerve cells or neurons, and the loss of the connections between the neurons. So this is a picture, a diagram of a neuron. Some people may know this very well, some people may not. So first of all, there's what's called the cell body, and this contains the nucleus where the DNA is, and basically all of the area, the machinery that allows this cell to function. It has these branches here called dendrites, and that's where the incoming information feeds into the cell. And then it has a long process here called an axon that is myelinated, so it's wrapped around with insulation, and then it has its nerve ending, and this nerve ending would connect with a dendrite of another neuron. Okay. So the neurons in our brain and in our body are amazingly complex, and this picture doesn't really do it justice. If you think of the cell body as Gladstone, its nerve terminal could be in Sydney. Okay, so our connections are incredibly long. We have this tiny little powerhouse and a very long connection, and that's obvious when you think about the nerves that go from our brain down our spinal cord, and then from our spinal cord down our legs to our toes. They're 1 metre in length, but it's got a tiny little cell body producing all the things that cell needs to function. And there are cells within our brain that are just as small in their cell body. Their axon is much more branched, and when you add all those branches up, they add up to the distance from here to Sydney if the telephone was about the size of a soccer ball. So as anybody knows, in Brisbane, if there's a car accident on the Bruce Highway, there's no getting from Gladstone to Sydney, right? Because there's no other way round, there's no other way to get that information through. And one of the things that we know but don't understand is a concept called cognitive reserve. Well, even though there are some blockages there, the information is still getting through, and we think about it as that there are other roads, not just the Bruce Highway, that you can go to get through, that you can go in other directions. And the more connections you have between the different nerve cells, the more likely it is that one blockage is not going to stop the transfer of information. That your verbal fluency can stay fluent, because even if you can't remember the exact word you're looking for, you've got another one that you can substitute that will mean pretty much the same, and you can still continue on with the conversation. The other really important thing about neurons is that they don't get replaced. And this is something that I find surprising when I talk to lay audiences, is that not everybody understands that. So our skin replaces, our hair grows, our livers regenerate, our heart cells regenerate, but our neurons, our brain cells, you're born with the number that you have through life, no more. Well, there's a tiny bit of the brain where it does happen, but essentially what you're born with is what you get, okay? And if they die, it's only going down. So here's a picture of boys at different ages, and what you also might not know is that really the most cell death actually happens here. You're born with a certain number of cells, and actually about half of them die in that first year of life. And that's actually really important. It's called programmed cell death, and it's really important for the nervous system to wire itself up properly so that only those connections that are useful stay alive. If you had connections everywhere, then you couldn't refine them to actually learn to walk, learn to talk, etc. And then it's pretty steady until you get to a certain age, and then there is age-related loss of your neurons. But it shouldn't impact that much. You might get a little bit of memory loss, but it's only when you get a disease or you have a traumatic event such as a stroke, or you get a disease such as dementia, or spinal cord injury, or trying to think of other motor neuron disease, for example, that you get a dramatic amount of neuronal cell death, and therefore it manifests as a disease. And it's about 50% after this 50%, if you go another 50% down, you lose that many nerve cells of a particular sort before you actually get symptoms. So this is a diagram of a brain, a healthy brain on this side, cut in half. Brain's about the size of a cauliflower, and doesn't quite look like a cauliflower, but we've got a nice plump healthy brain here. The white matter are the connections, and the grey matter here in sort of brown are the nerve cell bodies. And so you can see in advanced Alzheimer's that there's shrinkage of the brain, in particular here, an area called the basal forebrain, which is involved in memory and attention. The hippocampus, which is this area here, which is really important for short-term memory, it's practically gone here. And also in the cortex, the area of the brain that in primates in particular is particularly large and is important for our sort of higher order cognitive thinking. It's also been shrunk and damaged both in the white matter and in the grey matter here. And this is an area that's really important for our thinking, planning and imagination. And as I said, that shrinkage is due to the cell death and to the degeneration of the connections between the cells. So how does this happen? So all of these little black dots here are cells call cholinergic cells, and they reside in I can't point very well, in the basal forebrain. And you can see in this picture, in someone with Alzheimer's disease, there's many few black dots. 75% of them have died. Okay? There's also, when you look in a brain at this fine microscopic sort of sections, you can see two things that are characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. And that is here, this brown thing called plaques, amyloid plaques, that you might have heard of in the media, or amyloid beta or A beta. This is a protein that we're all making, but in some people you either make too much of it or it doesn't get cleared properly and it accumulates, it's quite sticky, it aggregates and clumps together in the brain, sort of precipitates out and forms a sticky mess here. And both the big globs and particularly the smaller globs of this protein are toxic to cells.
And what's the usual function of this protein?
It's, of all the money spent on Alzheimer's disease, nobody really cares what its normal function is. It comes from a larger protein, and that protein seems to have neuroprotective effects, and the fact that it gets chopped up into this sort of gloopy stuff is not really sure. It's probably not evolutionarily selected for, but it does seem that even it might have some function in cells, maybe also neuroprotective in some ways, positive, but when there's too much of it, it becomes a toxic protein. Yeah.
Thank you.
But we don't know what the larger protein does. The other one is tangles. So again, in the media, this could be called tau or neurofibrillary tangles. And tau is another protein that's normally found in our neurons. And it's really important for taking nutrients and cell components down the long axon. So what happens in a number of diseases, including Alzheimer's, is this protein gets modified in a certain way, and it gets modified too much, and again that causes it to clump together and form blockages within the neurons itself, either with the transport or changing things in the dendrites actually, such that the amyloid can become more toxic. And these things together cause the cognitive decline because there's glooping up of neurons, they're not talking to each other properly, they're beginning to die or get pruned back, and that's causing the cognitive decline. So just a little bit more on dementia, and that is that for genetic reasons or environmental factors, a large number of neurodegenerative diseases are linked to the accumulation of toxic proteins. So amyloid beta amyloid, the plaques, are associated with Alzheimer's disease, as is tau, but mutations in tau, so changes in the gene sequence that you can inherit from your parents, are not associated with Alzheimer's disease, but are actually associated with causing frontal temporal dementia. Huntington's disease is another disease that is caused by a change in a protein that then aggregates and blocks up the cells, the neurons. And Parkinson's disease, both the disease and the Parkinson's disease with dementia or Lewy body dementia is caused by accumulation of another protein called alpha-synuclein, of which in some cases there's also a change in the sequence and it's inherited. So, as I said, in Alzheimer's disease, you can get what's called early onset Alzheimer's disease. So this is at the age of maybe 40 or 50, though it can be as young as 20. And then there are risk factors that are associated with the development of Alzheimer's disease. Maybe 5% of people who get Alzheimer's disease have a causative change in their DNA sequence that can be passed on. So it's actually the vast minority of people who get Alzheimer's disease do so because they have a causative mutation in either the amyloid precursor protein, or APP. People with Down syndrome actually have 3 copies of the APP gene, and they invariably end up with an Alzheimer's-like dementia. And the vast majority are actually people who have changes in the DNA for a protein called presenilin, which actually chops up the APP into the smaller piece that's A beta that then globs and accumulates. And so that's the people who get familial Alzheimer's disease usually have a mutation in presenilin protein. But it's the minority, as I said. And we think that the same processes that happen in these people with Alzheimer's disease also happen in people with no genetic cause, because they get the same accumulation of the plaques and the tangles and the same degeneration in the same brain areas as those people who have genetic causes. So there are genetic risk factors, and if you get your DNA sent off to 21andMe or whatever the people are who will sequence your DNA, which they don't actually do, they just do bits and pieces, you might come back with a risk for Alzheimer's, and that will be a gene called ApoE. There are 3 forms of the ApoE gene that are normal within the population, but if you have one particular type, ApoE4, you're at much higher risk, 10 times more risk than somebody else in the general population of developing Alzheimer's disease. And we still don't really know why that is. But the one that I want to concentrate on, ApoE, age is by far the biggest risk. Not much we can do about that, unfortunately. We're all getting older. Diabetes, hypertension, education and diet are also have some risk associated or reduced risk associated with Alzheimer's development. And so sleep apnea is the one that I want to talk about. So let's talk about sleep. We all sleep, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, there are, you'll know this better than me, there are 4 stages of sleep, depending on what the literature is. You might say there are 3: awake, REM sleep, and non-REM sleep. But there are different stages of what's called non-REM sleep. Let's go down to REM sleep first here. REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. People have heard of that? Yep. So this is, your brain is actually quite active in REM sleep, and this is when your dreams occur, and because of that your eyes are moving. And actually in mice, they've tracked the eye movements during mice undergoing REM sleep, and if they were running around in a maze and where they were looking in their REM sleep, their eyes are going the way they would go if they were navigating a maze. So REM sleep is also associated with replaying the day's events and laying down memories. Then we have non-REM sleep, and there are several stages of this, but I just want to basically say the non-REM sleep is the restorative sleep. So here we have a diagram of what a night's sleep might look like. You start off awake, you go to sleep, and essentially you tend to go into the restful non-REM sleep as soon as possible. But then you'll have cycles where you'll go from the restful sleep into the dreaming REM sleep, back to the non-REM sleep, and so forth. And towards the end of the night's sleep, you have much more REM sleep than non-REM sleep. So why do we sleep? We also still don't know exactly why we sleep, but there are a number of leading reasons why people think we sleep. The important thing is we know it's essential. Sleep deprivation is actually torture, and if you keep animals awake and you keep waking them up, they will die. You need your sleep. So one of the reasons why we think we need sleep is to restore our bodies, that it just gives the cells in our bodies time to repair all the components of our cells that need turning over, to make new cells if we've, had some damage of our liver with a bit too much drinking or something like that. We just need the time and the energy to do this where we're not running around. Something that's only come out in the last few years is that sleep seems to be a really important process by which we take the waste from our brains out into our lymphatic system so it can be cleared from our body. That when we sleep, there's changes within the brain and the fluid within our brain that allows the toxins or just the waste products to get taken into that fluid, and then that fluid can pass it on so it can come out of its brain, out of the brain. So that's something that we're looking at that's really important at the moment. And as I hinted to before, that we think it might be really important for us to sleep, particularly, so this is probably in the non-REM sleep, but then the REM sleep, to lay down the day's memories, the things that are really important, and transfer them from short-term memory into long-term memory in a process called consolidation.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
What are some examples of the waste generated by our brain?
Yeah, so it would be sort of normal things. So our cells use a lot of energy, and in doing so, they produce just metabolic byproducts that get cleared out of all our cells. I can't think of a good example at the moment, but one of the other things that gets cleared out is actually amyloid beta. So it's one of the things that gets produced. So we know it's sort of an interesting thing. The more active your brain is, the more amyloid beta gets produced, and then it gets cleared out by this system of waste removal. And so when people don't have enough sleep, then that's likely to be able to build up. We're getting ahead. Yes?
How do you define more active? When you say more active, do you mean just more time awake or doing particular things?
Doing particular things, yeah. So there's two parts of this. The studies have been done in humans where they actually have a little probe into the spinal fluid, which is also what bathes the brain, and looking at people who need that probe in their brain because they had a stroke or something like that, where they're actually still awake and functioning, and then you've got people who are unconscious, and then you've got people who are brain dead. And if you look at that, the more awake you are, the more beta amyloid actually gets produced compared to the other two. But then you go and you look at mice and you put them through lots of training regimes and things, they produce more than the mice that are just sitting around, I don't know, watching telly. So yeah, computation where the brain has to be doing something rather than relaxing. Yes. So, dementia and sleep. So, as was said in the introduction, there is a link between the incidence of dementia and the incidence of disrupted sleep. So, 15 to 30% of middle-aged people have a form of sleep-disordered breathing. So that means their breathing is altered during their sleep, and the result of that is that their sleep becomes disrupted as well. And this increases to 50% of elderly people over 65 to 70. There's a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So it's not a huge change in your risk, it's a doubling or a little bit more, but given that 50% of elderly have this condition, that means there's a lot of people with this increased risk. We also know that people who have sleep-disordered breathing have cognitive impairment that starts at a younger age and is much faster than somebody who doesn't have sleep-disordered breathing. And flipping it around, 15% of people who have dementia, that's been attributed to the fact that they have changes in their sleep. So you can catch up on poor sleep. We all know that you have a very late night, or you have a particularly, disrupted night's sleep for whatever reason. Maybe you're flying on an international flight, maybe the people next door are having a party. We know that a poor night's sleep changes your cognitive abilities, both your ability to remember what you learnt the day before, but also your ability to undertake cognitive tasks that are new. And it's been said that one poor night's sleep is the same as being over 0.05 in your driving ability, and that translates to other cognitive tests as well. But we know that if you then have a good night's sleep, and that sleep may be longer, because the way sleep works is it actually sort of accumulates the need, and until you meet that need, you stay sleepy. So if you get a good night's sleep the next night, then your cognitive processes return to the normal baseline. But not if you have a reason for having disrupted sleep constantly. So this is some diagrams again of a good night's sleep, going through the non-REM and then the REM sleep, and this is what we think young adults do. Now, I've got teenage kids and I'm not sure that's quite right, but maybe this is 1 a.m. and then going on, but anyway. Then if we look at stylized for the elderly, you can see that there is both less REM and non-REM sleep. Now the question is this, is this just aging? Are we doing less and so we need less sleep, or are there physiological changes that mean the elderly have poorer sleep? And one of those we know is the change in sleep disordered breathing, or sleep apnea. So what is obstructive sleep apnea, or a sleep apnea, and sleep disordered breathing? Oh, I'm going way over time. You happy for me to keep going?
Yeah.
So obstructive sleep apnea is when there's a collapse of the soft palate or the tongue during sleep. So this is just a side-on view of somebody. They usually breathe this blue stuff, air, through their nose or through their mouth. But if there's a collapse back here at the back of the throat, that air physically can't get through, either because it's a narrower passage or that it's completely blocked. And what happens is that this happens repeatedly during sleep, reducing or completely stopping the airflow. And the way to re-engage the muscles that control that is you actually have to wake up. And you might only wake up for 30 nanoseconds, but you wake up, the muscles re-engage, the airway opens again, and then you can go back to sleep. Okay? Or you might wake up and you become insomniac because you can't go back to sleep. But most people with sleep apnea can go back to sleep, but they're just waking up to breathe and then going back to sleep. And I don't know if you've ever shared a room with someone with sleep apnea. They'll be breathing, they might be snoring a little bit. Okay, and you are waiting for them to have a breath because you can hear that they haven't. Okay, now.
If you've ever watched The Three Stooges.
Yeah, yeah. I spent a night in a hiking hut actually, and the only person who slept was the guy with sleep apnea. And every time we woke him up and said, "You've got to roll over," he would, and then he'd go straight back to sleeping with his very bad sleep apnea. Anyway, the reason why you might have sleep apnea is being overweight or obesity. This is the main reason in our population at the moment. There are also craniofacial features that mean it's more likely in children they can have sleep apnea, and this is because they've got large tonsils or adenoids so that the air can't get through. And there are other genetic or medical conditions as well that can lead to it. And the symptoms, I don't know if you've been able to read this, include memory loss, lots of concentration, snoring, etc. And then daytime sleepiness and mood changes. So some of these things are sort of similar to dementia, but it's not dementia if it's rescuable. Okay? So if you can change it back again, then you haven't got dementia. So this is what a stylized sleep apnea person's sleep might look like. And again, you can see that there's less restorative REM sleep, a lot of wake over the time of the sleep cycle, and much less non-REM sleep as well. Now, importantly, sleep apnea can result in hypoxia. So hypoxia is a lack of oxygen. So if there's not air coming into your lungs, then the oxygen is not going into the blood, it's not being passed on to your organs, and that the lack of oxygen, which can also happen with a stroke, is toxic to your cells and particularly neurons. And this is just another diagram of that. You've got your airflow going in and out. If you're not breathing for a bit, that's the apnea. And then you take a big breath. Your body might still be trying to breathe, but it's at this point with the apnea that the level of oxygen in your blood goes down, and that's where you've got the hypoxia. And it only comes back up again once you've had enough big breaths again. So what we've done in my lab is to try and understand what the most important things are that is going on with the sleep apnea and the risk for dementia. Is we developed a mouse model that has sleep disordered breathing. So we actually induced a condition that maps very well to the human condition. Clearly mice are not humans and they actually breathe quite differently, but it looks pretty good. And in those mice, we showed that it caused cognitive impairment even when they were, there was nothing else going on but their sleep apnea. It exacerbated the Alzheimer's pathology, the amyloid plaques that can accumulate, and it caused brain degeneration, in particular in those attention neurons, the basal forebrain neurons that died. And we were able to show that it was actually due to the intermittent hypoxia, this fluctuation of oxygen, so not complete oxygen loss. Our bodies are actually pretty good at recovering from that, and it was not through the lack of sleep. So we're also able to put mice on particular paradigms, which meant that they didn't have REM sleep and they didn't have non-REM sleep as well, and it was not due to the lack of sleep. The lack of sleep did cause memory changes, but not the same ones as the obstructive sleep apnea type model that we gave. So the treatment for obstructive sleep apnea is CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, these elephant masks that we get. And they're actually very good at curing both the hypoxia and the disrupted sleep. It essentially forces air down your throat, keeps your airways open, and therefore you don't have to wake up anymore to breathe, and therefore your sleep's fine and your oxygen levels are fine. The problem is that they're not that comfortable. People don't like to wear them and often choose to sleep in a different room to their partner who keeps kicking them because they've got sleep apnea than wear the machine, or wear it for enough of the night to get any benefit. So it's estimated that if you wear it properly, 7 hours of CPAP, you could theoretically restore most of your sleep back to normal. So we put our mice on CPAP. We didn't really. We just gave them, we just stopped them getting hypoxia, and that was able to prevent both the hypoxia and the sleep disruption, and stop the degeneration and restored the cognitive function, at least in mice. Now we don't know in humans. We know CPAP's good at restoring the memory from a bad night's sleep, but we don't know what actually happens over the longer term. And part of the reason for that is because often people are not diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea, or they've had it for a long period of time before they come in. So there's a long period of work to do before we actually understand what's happening. But there are clinical implications, and this is mostly anecdotal. Many people, as I said, don't know they have OSA. They might be living alone, or they might just not be disrupting their partner, or they haven't done anything about it for many years. However, we know when we've gone into Greg's sleep clinic up at the Prince Charles that many OSA patients being assessed for a CPAP have cognitive impairment. And in our studies, maybe a third of them were actually in our research diagnosed by us, but not by a doctor, that they would be demented, and we ethically had to refer them on. We know from the other side, in talking to our clinicians, that many elderly being assessed at the memory clinic actually have sleep issues, and when they get the sleep issues treated, their memory gets good again, so they don't have dementia and don't need to go down that pathway. So one of the important things that's come out of my research is just that the clinicians need to talk to each other more. Neither the sleep clinic nor the dementia clinic really thought that the research we were doing was going to be very useful, but they've both changed their practice now. And also, if I had OSA, I would use my CPAP. I don't know that's going to stop me getting dementia, and certainly if I've got genetic dementia, it's not going to stop it, but it's got other benefits to health. And so it's worth getting treated for sleep. And I just want to finish by thanking a team of people who have helped me and a whole bunch of funding that has allowed me to do my research. And I'm very happy to take questions, even though I've gone way over time. So thank you.
When you said middle-aged people, is it from 40, 50?
Yeah, so it's sort of 40-ish.
Okay.
Yeah. It's all downhill from 25. I think. Yep.
Do you believe Alzheimer's has increased over the last century or so? Or is it just more reported?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we know that the diagnosis of Alzheimer's like dementia has gone up. Now, it depends how you do the statistics. There are many more people living. They're not dying of heart attacks or strokes, so they're living to an older age. And as the population ages, the percentage of people with Alzheimer's disease goes up because of that. So actually, the incidence of Alzheimer's disease in our population today is probably smaller than it was, say, 15 years ago. And I think that's because a lot of the sorts of, eat healthy, exercise, etc., is impacting on that risk. But because the population's still aging, the total number of people with Alzheimer's is still increasing. So, yeah, depends how you dice the cake.
There was a question. Yep.
It's all right.
You keep thinking. Yeah.
Couple of months ago, I think there was if you will remember it, there was a doctor from
QIMR?
That's Royal Brisbane Hospital.
Yeah.
And he had a pretty rigorous sort of lecture on the brain, and he just touched a little bit of Alzheimer's. Now, you have made it very clear, because I am a person who is not too 100% with the sleep.
Yeah.
And I want to know how much percentage or how much is the contribution of sleep. I wake up every time I toss it little bit, small. One thing which helped me was I never sleep straight, facing the ceiling, never. So I don't snore at least. So percentage or a weightage of it in because there are you've mentioned about 4 type of Alzheimer's or the sources of it. Sleep, where does that fit in? Because that's my problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we don't know. We know that if you have sleep disordered breathing, that's about a 3-fold risk of dementia, and that's a hard thing to try and put into, if 1 person in 10 gets dementia, then your doubling means now 2 people out of 10 get dementia, but it's not that simple because it's times in your normal risk. So I can't do the maths.
But the mechanism is the same because it affects the production of those, of cleaning of those, what they call it?
The cleaning of the waste.
Waste of or it increases those proteins.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the mechanism is the same.
The mechanism we don't know. So it may be that some people end up with dementia because they're getting no REM sleep and they're not consolidating their memories. So that wouldn't necessarily be dementia unless it interferes with daily living. Then there might be some people who are not getting enough non-REM sleep and they're not clearing out enough waste, and that might lead to dementia. And then you've got people, and this is one of the things we're actively trying to do, who have the intermittent hypoxia, but not everybody with obstructive sleep apnea gets dementia. So is there a level of hypoxia, or is it the number of hypoxic events? Is it the length of them? Is it an accumulation over your lifespan? We just don't know. But at least with our research, we've gone, we think hypoxia is the important bit. So maybe your not having sleep is fine because you're not having the hypoxia, and therefore everything's okay. But we just don't know.
Last question from me. Is it possible that I walk into a clinic now and ask him, can you count my
Plaques.
neurons or plaques or something?
Yep.
Is it possible now?
And so it is and it isn't. So you can't go to your neurologist or your GP and say, I want a brain scan to see if I've got plaques. But if you enroll in a trial for Alzheimer's disease, it's likely that you would get put in 2 scanners. One would be an MRI or magnetic resonance image, and that will look at the shrinkage of your brain, and we can look at it and go, your hippocampus is a bit small and you've lost your basal forebrain or not. And the other one is a PET scan, which is positron emission tomography, and there's a way that you can look at the plaques with a radioactive tag and see whether you have plaques or not. Now, the reason why it's not available for everyone is because there's no good treatment. So we won't scan you unless we can treat you, because we also know that 30% of the population that is cognitively perfectly okay have the same number of plaques in their brain as someone with Alzheimer's disease. So there's something else going on there. And so we don't want to tell you about that, even though you're at increased risk, because there's nothing we can do.
And what's the point of doing any PET scans then?
Yeah, so essentially in the clinic there isn't any point, but for the research we want to know what's happening in your brain so we can associate it with other things or put you in a clinical trial. So there, in the news, I guess it was maybe 6 months ago, there was an Alzheimer's drug approved by the FDA. Does anybody remember that? And it was controversial, so there was a 7:30 report actually about it, whether it was useful or not. And what it is a drug that will get rid of the amyloid. Okay?
Yeah.
It's really, really good at getting rid of the amyloid, but in all the clinical trials with all the different sorts of this drug, there hasn't been any increase in the cognitive abilities of the people who took it. Now the FDA approved it, but it's really expensive and nobody knows who will benefit from it because there's no evidence of benefit. Apparently, the reason why it was approved is so that the clinical trials people can give it to people who don't yet have any cognitive impairment. So the risk, there's a complicated thing about trials that you can do no harm, essentially. So it was deemed safe enough to give people who didn't yet have cognitive impairment but had amyloid in their brains. And in the next year, there'll be
an announcement about what's happened to those people and whether they have stopped their cognitive decline relative to people who had the same amount of amyloid but weren't on the drug. So we'll see. Yeah. And then when they can scan you, see you've got amyloid and give you a drug, then it will become more widestream but very expensive.
Probably just thinking ahead here, but has there been any studies looking at amyloid clearance of the lymphatic system with normal sleep or people with disturbed sleep yet, or is that?
It's coming. There's a good group in Sydney who are doing some of these things. It's hard to know because the PET molecule is about the plaque, and probably the toxic bit is not so much the plaque but the smaller globs. It's really hard to know what's going on there. You really have to have a lumbar puncture or something. But there are people now looking at it. One of the really hard things was all the Alzheimer people who were doing their Alzheimer trials explicitly excluded people with sleep problems because they were too hard. And so we don't have the data. We actually have to now go back and look at the data. Yeah, they're too hard. They have cognitive impairment. Yeah, that's right.
Funny that.
Yeah. There's one question up the back.
Waste you can do, I suppose it's all over the body. So with something like fasting and detoxing that health clinics promote, is that the sort of thing? It's not just in the brain.
Yeah, so all of our body has to get rid of waste, and our lymphatic system. So you get when you get ill, the immune system cells, the B cells, come out of your bone marrow and go around and try and find viruses or bacteria or whatever. And that system of being able to get rid of dead cells or toxins from your body sort of happens automatically and doesn't seem to be linked with sleep. But the system in the brain seems to be that it's only when your brain is inactive that the fluid within your brain, we still don't really understand it, seems to be able to move sufficiently to carry things with it. It's not a very good answer. And all of the sort of the detoxing things, it's more, I feel that's more about, eating well more generally rather than, doing a juice only diet or something. That's not going to, I don't think that's going to do anything for you.
Cutting out on alcohol, sugar, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so they're general, good things. Eat healthily, exercise, your body will be better.
There is some report they say if you keep learning, say learn a new instrument,
Yes.
how effective that will prevent.
Yeah. So this is the idea of cognitive reserve, so that if you make more connections, you are better able to stay, if you're learning new things and doing new things, you're making more connections, and therefore there are many more paths to get to different information. The studies that have specifically looked at this, so they've got people and they've trained them on a particular task. What they found was that people got very good at doing that task, but that it didn't transfer over to another task. So the sort of conclusion from that was that if you do a cryptic crossword, which is recall, you get very good at recalling a certain thing. But if you do a quick crossword, it's recall, so you get particularly good at accessing particular bits of information. But if you do a cryptic crossword where you've got to think laterally, that's the sort of thing that is maybe more transferable. But it's incredibly hard to study because everybody's brain works differently. And so this idea of cognitive reserve is still, a bit nuanced in whether it does exist or not. But the more highly educated population tend to, their age relative to the less educated population, so we're talking people with postgraduate study versus somebody who's only finished high school, relative to their risk of getting dementia, the higher educated ones tend to get dementia at a later age, or don't get dementia because they've died of something else, compared to the more lowly educated. But when they do get dementia, they actually they decline faster, so they end up at the same spot, but their quality of life is better for a longer period of time.
And that's just because they have this cognitive reserve that they.
That's the thought. Yeah, that's what's been defined. Well, they must have had cognitive reserve. Yeah, a way around rather than the Bruce Highway.
Because they're learning different things? Or?
They've just got. There are lots of theories. It's just the idea is they've got more connections, and so if you lose some of them, you're still able to function normally for longer.
Could that also be that you said before that when the brain's active, it's producing more amyloid? So if they have a very active mind, they're learning things or challenging themselves more, maybe they're producing more amyloid, hence they decline faster when it does occur?
Maybe that's an equally good hypothesis. That's exactly right. And we don't know, it could be, to flip it round, maybe the people who end up in tertiary education have a different way their brain works, and that allows them to go to tertiary education, which means that even though their brains are highly active, they're producing less amyloid than somebody else when they're thinking. We don't know the cause and effect.
At the start of the talk, you mentioned that our number of brain cells is set for life after like 1 year, 1 year of age. I was listening to a neuroscientist do a TED talk a few years ago, and she was doing research into the effects of exercise on the brain.
Yes. Yep.
And I was under the impression from that, it's a bit vague.
No, you're absolutely
because I am
right.
aging, but the brain, certain parts of the brain actually get bigger. Well, what is growing?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So one of the areas of the brain that is unusual is the hippocampus, and it does produce new neurons.
And that was a short-term memory one?
Yeah, that's the short-term memory one. And exercise stimulates that process. There's a number of things that do. Being cognitively active, enriched environments, at least for mice, stimulates the production of these new neurons in that particular region in the hippocampus. And those neurons are important for particular sorts of memory in mice. It's navigation memory, and in aging, the production of those neurons goes down with aging, but you can stimulate it with exercise.
But she was pretty jolly excited about it. Like, she was an absolute couch potato and in another area of research. I can't remember why she launched into this, but she became a real, gym bunny.
Yep.
After it. So, is there any way of quantifying to us how big an impact does the exercise have?
So again, it's really good in mice when you're narrow and you can control them, and it's really bad in humans. So in mice, if you put a mouse on a running wheel for 3 weeks, and mice love to run, they run like 5 kilometres a night for a little mouse. I can barely run 5 kilometres a week. Their production of nerve cells in the hippocampus go in an 18 to 24-month-old mouse, which is a 70-year-old human, goes back up to that of a late teenager mouse, and its memory, the ability to do the maze tests goes back to the young mouse as well.
Sorry, in what period of time?
A 3-week period of running. Now, what's really weird about it is less running doesn't work, but more running goes off as well. So
you've got to find the sweet spot.
There's a sweet spot.
How do you know?
We don't. So, and again, it's in mice. So there's a group at the Brain Institute, Perry Bartlett, who's actually he's done a huge exercise study in people and cognitive testing and doing MRIs for their hippocampus and measuring a whole lot of blood and things, and putting people on different sorts of exercise. So whether it's weights or whether it's cardiovascular or whether it's a combination, And he's got some exciting results, but I can't remember what they
What about the blue zone people?
Yeah.
Surely that tells us something,
Yeah.
because they stay so mentally alert into such a, and they're not gym bunnies.
Yeah.
They're just doing your normal active sort of
Who's that?
old-fashioned kind of.
There's
Blue zone.
There's a, I think we have to be careful here, talking about the number of cells and cognitive ability, because the number, Lizzie, I'll get you to talk about this, but the number of cells and the number of connections that those cells have are different.
different. Absolutely,
Can
yeah.
you
So
talk
each
about that?
each cell, each of those, a cell with its dendrites may be connected by, let's say, 1,000 or more cells, and with many different synapses, so the actual connections. And there's a whole bunch of integration of the information where several different neurons connect to the same one, and that information gets integrated and then passed on with some clever computations. And so the new neurons in the hippocampus, we know that you need to generate them and they integrate into that circuit, and that somehow is important for that spatial memory that the mouse is doing. But that doesn't affect some of the, all the other cognitive stuff that's happening in the cortex, and the cortical neurons don't get replaced. One of the areas of research is to say, well, can you get that neuron in the hippocampus to migrate over here and get replaced? And not yet. Yeah, but we don't need to be transplanting things, we just need to tell the ones that are there to go off and do something a bit different.
Yeah, before we move on to that question, Sharon, can you clarify the blue zone people? There was a question that some people are not aware of what that is. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that, Steve?
Blue zones are parts of the world where people live unusually long lifespans. So there's a place in Japan, there's a place in Greece, and some guys studied them and tried to work out what it is about them that makes them live so long. They live a lot longer than the average human. So generally they eat a lot of, natural foods, and they don't go to the gym, but they do regular exercise, but as part of their lifespan. So
As part of their lifestyle.
Yeah, they're
Lots of gardening.
farming and
Or in Sardinia, they're hopping up mountains after goats and things like that. They have really good community life, so rich social connections right through into old age. Yeah. There's one American community, Seventh-day Adventists, and one of their doctors is 95 and still assisting in theatre.
Yeah.
Assisting, mind you.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm sure you've all heard about is the Mediterranean diet.
Yeah.
And this is sort of part of the Sardinia group, which is, but there was also a study which I just laugh about, that maybe the Mediterranean diet is a bit debunked, because actually half the people who were said to be living a long time were actually people who had died and the relatives hadn't said that they were dead, they were still collecting their pensions. So Mediterranean diet, not so sure. Sardinia, definitely. So on a population average, there was a bit of a wobble there.
I know they can't do these experiments on humans for ethical reasons, but what is it about mice that is so close to us?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And why not some other animal?
Yeah.
Is there a way of progressing from mice?
Yes,
Where to from there?
No, so mice are sort of your classic animal model. Their brain is not exactly the same as ours, but all of the processes are nearly identical. And in fact, even in a fruit fly, the way the nerve cells connect to each other and talk to each other are pretty well identical. Okay. Now, the reason why we use mice rather than dogs or monkeys, first of all, is because they're small. You can put them in little cages and have lots of them, and their lifespan is relatively short. And they have more of this type of brain that we have than a fruit fly does. So when you're starting to talk about cognitive things, yes, you can train bees and flies to go through mazes, but it's not quite the same as the way the mouse does it. And then when you start thinking about dogs or sheep or something like that, you've got much bigger spaces, their lives are much longer, and so it's much harder to do those sorts of tests on, but they do get done. So beagles actually they live quite a long time and undergo a sort of Alzheimer's disease dementia. Polar bears get Alzheimer's disease, apparently, but I'm not sure they'd be a good animal model. And the other thing that's good about mice is that we, because they've been the lab model, is that they're very easy to genetically change, and so we can give them human-like mutations or put genes in or take them out that allow us to study the mechanisms and the processes in a way that we can't in a human. And also we can then chop them up and look at their brains, which you definitely can't in a human.
Is it true that the mouse model all come from the same genetic stream, so that they're
Yes.
all genetic?
Yes.
similar?
So there are several what we call now I've forgotten the word, inbred strains,
Right.
so that they are genetically as similar as possible. When we do the aging studies and the exercise studies on the mice with the neurogenesis, even though they're genetically the same and they've been in the same cages, yada yada yada, there's still a normal spectrum of what their behaviour is, and there's a group of mice that actually don't do the neurogenesis so well, or they don't run as well, or whatever. So trying to find out what those differences are is important.
Sorry, there's a question up here.
Yep.
It sounds like we all realise that this avalanche of dementia is coming.
Yeah.
And there is also sort of cultural attitudes that a lot of people may have, where the older you get, they're like, oh well, I sleep less, you know, it's normal.
Yeah.
People also have a bit more of an acceptance of snoring. It's like, oh well, you know, I'll just move into the next room.
Exactly.
I just thought, since we know so much of this, there doesn't seem to be that public education campaigns which could, you know, just the other day in the mail, the bowel cancer reminder came through, and I thought, wow, that's so effective. Is there something more that can be done to really? Snoring is, you know, they come up with some taglines around. It's not as.
Our work on the mice and the sleep apnea and links to Alzheimer's is just about to get published, and I imagine you can say I saw it first here. I imagine there's going to be a lot of interest from, you know, the general public on that, but until it's peer reviewed and published, there's not much you can say. And then the next problem is it's in mice. And we don't have any evidence at the moment that wearing your CPAP actually stops you getting dementia if you're in a risk. So it's again this link between what the research, what the implications are, what the reality is. Now, so that's why nothing's happened. When I started the research, as I said, I was talking both to the sleep clinic and the memory clinic, and they thought I was a bit nuts, but they were happy to help out. And then both sets of people, when we started getting the results in the mice and actually some of the results in the humans, the clinics started to think differently. And the clinicians, for example, you come into my office for a memory test, you ask about sleep, oh, you've got sleep apnea. Well, before I go through my test of your memory, how about you get that treated and then come back to me? And people didn't. And so it actually changed that clinician's practice, but it hasn't, we haven't, you know, rolled that out. And part of that is because it takes money, that you have to retrain the clinicians, etc., etc. And I'm good at playing with mice and not so good at playing with humans. So it's a case of, somebody getting the money to develop the program to get people to do it, or me giving lay talks and just saying, hey, how about you do this, and maybe it'll, you know, get through
all the medical journals.
Yeah.
But just for my old Queensland Health hat here.
Exactly.
The last thing Queensland Health wants you to do is market anything.
Yeah.
Because the moment you market something, you just blow out the waiting list. and that's not what they want.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit of there's definitely a denial of information on some components of things, particularly expensive procedures.
Probably it takes $2,000 to get a CPAP machine.
Yeah.
And the problem is it's the sort of wealthy, well-educated people that go
Yep.
off and buy their CPAP machines.
Yep.
And it's the people that desperately need them, you know, they have to go on a waiting list for
Yep.
things like health, and, or they don't want to wear them.
Yeah.
Yeah, up until when I left, there was a CPAP program where people who are on a healthcare card or pension of some sort would get a free machine. But it was on the verge of blowing out past what money we had to spend on it. So there may be a waiting list started. But certainly when I was there, most people who got it, if they could demonstrate they could keep using it, would get to keep it.
Okay.
Yeah, we got a question here, Frank.
Yeah, so we already touched on lifestyle and food. So I was wondering if there are possibly supplements where you would consider, they might help our brain to stay healthier longer.
Yeah. So the sleep idea is taking melatonin to make sure you sleep at the right times and things like that. It helps me with jet lag. I think it's probably a placebo effect, but I don't care because at least I go to sleep. But I think there is some good evidence that melatonin regulates your circadian rhythms and therefore can help you fall asleep. In terms of the supplements, there's a lot of, again, I would say anecdotal evidence. Cumin keeps coming up, Brazil nuts come up, various things, but is it turmeric? I don't know. Anyway, these things. As a scientist, if they're not going to hurt you, go for it. But there's no good evidence that they do anything. But if it's part of a broader project, of what you're doing with your life, then maybe it's good. What we're trying to do is go, okay, what is the hypoxia doing? And we know that that's killing the attention neurons, and so if somebody doesn't want to or can't buy their CPAP, can we give them a drug that stops those cells dying, and therefore that will stop their risk of dementia, irrespective of anything else that's going on. But that's different to what you're
that's
saying.
That's neuroprotective drugs then.
Neuroprotective
Do they exist?
There are none on the market, but there are some in development. Yeah. Basically starting to go through the clinical trials. Sorry. I think you were first.
It's the same question which I asked that learned doctor who came here with a lecture on brain, because he touched the same issue of dementia and all that. The question was that that's exactly the question which I asked him also, and he said that you better ask it to someone who is involved in all this. So we got you. So the question is that because it's an irreversible process, once the damage is done, you're not going backwards at all. It's done. And as you said, there is no more neurons being created there.
Except
so, yeah. So, are there any symptoms which a layman, like not me, but someone, has to be careful about it, that it's the start of Alzheimer's or something? Nothing?
So we have in the field when we recruit people for studies, and some are diagnosed with dementia and some have a diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and then we have a group of healthy controls, but memory complainers. So people who come up with the right number, they can recall the Donald Trumps, they can recall their list of animals starting with F, but they think their memory's declined. And it all depends, because we all have different, my mother says, I've never been able to navigate, so I'm always getting lost, so that's not, I wasn't demented at 20. So relative to yourself, you might have gone down, but in a population average, you haven't. As far as I'm aware, those memory complainers are no more likely to go on to develop dementia than those who don't complain. I'm clinging on to that. So at the moment, you know, if you think your memory is getting worse, you know, that would maybe put you in the memory complainer. When it's starting to interfere with what you're doing, I think that's where you go and get a proper. You don't just go to your GP, but you go to a memory clinic. But maybe talk to your GP about other things. What else am I doing in my life, like sleeping well or exercising, that might, you know, be something that you can address.
Can napping during the day undo some of the damage caused by bad sleep during the night? And do we see any evidence for like differences in prevalence of Alzheimer's in different cultures that maybe do siesta?
Yeah. So I think it's a good question. I'm not aware of that. I mean, the Southern European sort of Mediterranean diet, I guess maybe more Spain end than the Italian end, have a nap during the day. After lunch you have a siesta and then you go later. Maybe that, you know, there's something to be said for that. Your napping, correct me if I'm wrong, napping tends to put you into non-REM sleep.
Depends on how long you sleep.
Nap for.
But there's plenty of evidence that napping improves your cognitive function just with a 15 to 20 minute nap.
Yeah.
If you sleep longer than about 15 or 20 minutes and you go into slow wave sleep, that's when you wake up feeling really groggy and you don't feel refreshed at all. But yeah, there's plenty of evidence that short naps improve, and so there may be some connection with the fact that you're sleeping better and any of these outcomes.
Yeah. So again, there's not the people who tend to live long and sort of like the Japanese, they're less likely to, compared to Americans, to get dementia, has been put down more to diet and lifestyle factors like not being overweight. Then I don't think they sleep at all, do they? As a general population. Yeah. So.
And do older people tend to nap more during the day?
Well, I think
stereotype?
Anecdotally, again, they do, but they also have more likelihood to have daytime sleepiness because their nighttime sleep is worse. And whether that's because of brain changes, hormonal changes, and things like that, which have nothing to do with dementia, so they're just catching up because they can, they don't have to run off to a meeting, or whether there's actually some physiological reason why those changes happen.
Yeah, with the high incidence of sleep apnea and the amount of sleep disturbance that old people get, there's all sorts of other sleep disturbing factors in age. Then I think if you add all those up, it'd be surprising if they didn't have daytime naps. So yeah, it's definitely what they do at night affects what they need during the day. And that's why grumpy old men are grumpy. Sleep at night.
Exactly. Yeah.
You mentioned that turmeric and nuts and so on have not been proven clinically to matter. Is that because not enough studies have been done to justify it, or they've been studied and found that they really don't matter?
A bit of both. So they rise to the top of the pool because they have been studied and they've been shown to have some benefit. For example, you put mice, they have to eat, you know, a kilogram of turmeric a day or something, and they get better memory, you know, those sorts of things. And so people think, oh, I'm now going to have turmeric on my coffees, sort of thing. There is a trial going on in Melbourne where I'm not quite sure of the population, but elderly, I don't know if they're MCI, mild cognitive impaired, or Alzheimer's or not, where they're getting 1 Brazil nut a day, and this is to increase their selenium, which I can't remember. Selenium has got something to do with stopping the tau accumulating as tangles. And the dose of selenium that the mice had is, you know, about the right amount in 1 Brazil nut. except each Brazil nut varies by about 100-fold, so who knows what they're actually having any particular day. And the other thing we know is the people who do best are the people in trials. So if you're worried about your health, enroll in a clinical trial, because you'll get everything else sorted out, and then you get the placebo effect. So yeah, so that study's ongoing, and I can only imagine that it will come out either positive or, you know, not non-conclusive, and that's because everybody in the trial is going to have such a broad set of other things going on. There will be people who, even though they're not eating the Brazil nut, will be getting selenium because, I don't know, they eat raw carrots that have not been washed and they're getting the selenium from the dirt on the carrot, you know, or something like that. So it's just really hard to do properly.
Yeah, there's always a downside. We know that Brazil nuts accumulate radioactive minerals too, and so Brazil nuts are much more radioactive than a lot of other foods.
Yeah.
So there you go. Take one.
I'll just ask about, this might not be up your alley, but just to clarify the sleep states, they're opposite in a baby, aren't they? Baby's rapid eye movement sleep is light sleep.
Yeah.
Their still sleep is deep sleep, and most of the baby's sleep is the REM light sleep.
I actually have no idea about babies.
Yeah.
That's right.
It wouldn't surprise me because they're busy learning stuff, and the laying down of the memory and rewiring the brain is the dreaming state, which is the REM sleep, which is the closer to awake. So the brain's really active.
Right.
And their cells are young and healthy.
There was a question at the back.
Oh, just a comment. My son used this might be an alternative to the expensive, was it CCAP?
Yeah.
He just bought this, it's a vest that he wears. It vibrates when he lays on his back.
Yeah.
And it just trains him to sleep on his side.
Yeah. And there are other things. There are various mouth guards and things that open. So because CPAP, even though it's incredibly effective, the compliance of using it properly and long enough and things is so low. There's a lot of work trying to work out other ways to do things that are much more tolerable for people. Yeah, so that's one of the things that, trigger to make you roll over so you're not on your back. So things like that.
My mum's doctor said put a tennis ball on your back.
That's
I mean, so like,
or somebody's had
beanbag or something.
Buttons or something sewn
something
into
to
the back
stop
of their
you.
90s
Yeah.
so that they go uncomfortable. Yeah.
She didn't like wearing her CPAP.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
I listened to another TED talk.
Yeah.
And it was a sleep scientist, and she was saying that the early morning waking period, around about 3 to 4, is normal.
Yeah, so again, sleep is not I'm more the dementia side than the sleep side, but there's some really interesting research about when people wake up and things, and so there was a thing that I'd heard that it was in, I don't know, some particular population, that it was normal to wake up at 2 or 3 and go and have a chat with your neighbour and then go back and go to sleep again. And that we know circadian rhythms change over our lifespan as well. Like teenagers, they do go to bed later and wake up later. And there's a whole bunch of evolutionary things why that might be, that you need people to be awake at all times. And so different people have, at stages of life, do different things. You know, the young ones stay up partying half the night and protect you from the lions, and then the old people wake up at 2 a.m. and protect you from the lions, and and so forth. Yeah, it's interesting. It's fascinating.
Yep. So I guess just taking a step back, I think there was a recent paper showing that the link between the serotonin, hypothesis and depression, the link is actually a lot more shaky than what we have believed. So I'm just wondering, like, how was the link between amyloid and tau and Alzheimer's disease. How was it established, and is it possible that one day we realize that there's no link
Yeah,
at all?
that's a great question. So one of the things we know is that the serotonin, if you change serotonin levels, it's quite good. I may have this wrong, but quite good at treating depression, but that doesn't mean it's the cause of depression. The lack of it is the cause of depression, something like that, or vice versa. So this is the thing with the amyloid. So you only get a formal diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease with an autopsy and looking on a slide at the brain to say that it's got amyloid plaques and tau tangles and particular degeneration. So anybody who doesn't have amyloid in their brain can't have Alzheimer's disease. They must have another form of dementia. So there's a sort of a chicken and egg thing happening a little bit. What we know now is that people who have healthy, normal brain function can have the same amount of amyloid plaque in their brain as somebody who has dementia. So that says it's not a lone causative. We also know that people who have dementia, who have had all their plaque cleared out of their brain by the trial of these drugs, still have dementia. So there is a group of people who are saying we have got the wrong target. We should not be going down the amyloid pathway. It's been proven wrong. But there's also a group of people who are quite invested in the amyloid hypothesis and really believe that you just have to treat people early enough before their brain degenerates, and then it won't degenerate. But the scientific evidence, we don't know the answer.
Yeah, it does seem that, I mean, if the amyloid, you're saying it was toxic to the cells, and it maybe is contributing to the cell death, and once you've already got the cell death, well, we know we're not going to get them back, so it seems like that would be a preventative if it's going to be anything.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why we think that they had to get the FDA approval so they could treat people, etc., etc.
It doesn't make sense to me that it would be a treatment at all, because you're still, by the time you've got the symptoms, we know there's less cells. So.
And that's also, so the treatment for Alzheimer's at the moment is a drug called cholinesterase inhibitors, which you may have heard as Aricept or donazepam, and which is given to basically anyone who's diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And it works by tricking the brain into thinking that the attention neurons are still alive. So if you lose some of them, it keeps the neurotransmitter around longer so that the brain can still sort of function. But the problem is we know that by the time that people get diagnosed with dementia, more than 50% of those nerves, which were the little black dot ones, maybe 75% have already died, and the treatment doesn't stop the rest of them dying, and so it doesn't work for very long, if at all. And so people go, oh, well, that's not the cause, because we can't treat it, but that's where the neuroprotection comes back in again, to keep them alive, and then maybe they can grow their branches again and make those connections again. So we need more researchers.
Is there anyone looking at a quick way of getting a little snip of brain tissue and?
Well, the problem is we snip a bit of brain tissue and there goes some memory, or the ability to talk, or
it's going anyway.
But no,
you wouldn't do it.
You just
have
have
a
to
definitive treatment.
That's right.
And is there any research into how the gut bacteria actually influences the permeability of the brain barrier?
Yeah, there is research going on with that, and we know that the gut, for example, can change serotonin levels in the brain and so forth. And there's some the predominant Alzheimer's theory is that it's amyloid. There are other theories which include it's about sort of like a bit like a diabetes, and one of the ones that's coming through is this idea that maybe gut bacteria talking to the brain might have something to do with it as well. Yeah, but I don't know the details on it.
For circadian rhythm to work the best for us, is it best that optimally we get up with the sun and go to bed? In other words, rather than staying up late and getting up late, does that matter?
I don't know the answer, but that doesn't work for me. I'm a stay up late, and I can sleep with completely outside and I'll still be asleep at 9 o'clock in the morning.
I have heard that the early morning light, that gentle early morning light, stimulates the pineal gland to produce melatonin.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure.
Right, that's true, but how important is that? If you stay up late, and I'm talking to people in different countries who are doing psychotherapy with clients around the world, so, and they get up very late, so is that bad?
Yeah, there's a guy who I collaborate with who's looking at circadian rhythms in mice, and one of the things in Parkinson's disease is that circadian rhythms go a bit haywire, which is not something that I'm aware of that happens in Alzheimer's disease. So I guess in the sort of work I'm doing, it doesn't matter when you sleep, as long as you sleep and that you don't have hypoxia would be the idea. But whether that's true for all conditions, we don't know. We know that if you put some people in a room or a cave with no light at all, their circadian rhythms gets shorter and gets down to I think 22 or 23 hour sort of cycle. And then jet lag is the classic where you have to swap your cycle around, and certainly being out in the sun is re-triggering the melatonin cycle is something that seems to work for people to switch that over. But whether that's truly that you should go to bed when the sun goes down and get up when the sun comes up, I don't know.
They're a couple of the major triggers to managing your circadian rhythm, though, light and loss of light.
Yeah.
So they're called zeitgeibers. There's certain things throughout the day that help reset your clock to a standard 24-hour cycle. Things like morning exercise, when you eat, routine, but certainly we were designed to be relatively inactive when it was dark and start getting up early to go and find your first meal. And I mean, that was 100,000 years ago. We haven't changed much since then, but except for the electric light.
Well, the ones who survived were doing that.
Yeah.
Would that be evolutionarily?
Yeah, that's
Obviously.
right. Yeah, that there might be people who in different
Outliers.
Yeah. And then again, it comes down also to community and what works for a community. So just going completely off topic, one of the things that I find really interesting is this idea of neurotypical and a normality curve of things. And there's this idea that it's actually really helpful to have paranoid people, and there's really helpful as a community to have people who are completely, have no fear whatsoever, because they play important roles in the safety of the community, and therefore you maybe don't want the entire community to be paranoid and hiding at every drop of a hat. But having some people who are more sensitive to things and other people who aren't, they play different roles within that community, and therefore the community as a whole survives, and the genetics get passed on. Yeah. So there's usefulness in having diversity. And I think if you think about a lot of our artists and creative writers and things were often not what you would call neurotypical, and they have really enriched our culture. So there you go. Maybe that's a good point to end on.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie. Thank you. We'll congratulate Lizzie on her excellent talk.
And fantastic questions. It's always good.
Let's open up our thanks. Lay it down or get into it anyway.
Oh yeah, help me sleep.
Well, thanks again. Thanks everybody for coming. Some of you may want to head